So, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is an honor and a great pleasure to welcome Professor Jill Lepore, who is currently traveling Germany to promote her seminal study, These Truths, which was recently translated into German with the CH Beck Verlag under the German title Diese Wahrheiten. The KWI is happy to present a scholar who in the United States is something of a star, while Diese Wahrheiten is the first attempt to present her work to a German audience. Jill Lepore did graduate and postgraduate work at Tufts University, at the University of Michigan and Yale. Since 2003, she has been at Harvard University, where she teaches at the Department of History as David Woods Camper 41 Professor of American History. Our guest has so far published numerous articles, which I can't go into, and 12 books on very diverse aspects of American history, including a historical novel. Her meticulous explorations range from King Philip's racial war against the Indians in the 17th century to liberty, slavery, and conspiracy in 18th century Manhattan, American ideas of life and death, Benjamin Franklin's youngest sister, the Tea Party, the cartoon character Wonder Woman, into whose secret history she dived, and many more topics. Most of Jill Lepore's books are also elegantly reflexive mediations on the history of historiography, on the origins of our ways of making sense in the name of history, and on the tools, methods, materials, and epistemological problems arising from historical curiosity. Next to this impressive bulk of scholarly work and having raised 3 children, Jill Lepore is a staff writer at the magazine The New Yorker. Supposedly, quite a few of us who are not historians know her work from this part of her professional life. She has contributed numerous brilliant essays to the magazine, among them an intriguing reconstruction, this is one of my favorites, of the origins of the word disruption, disruption, in the wastelands of management guidebooks. And more recently, a very moving piece about her best friend who left her personal computer to Jill Lepore after a premature death. If you read this last piece, it immediately becomes obvious why Jill Lepore has a huge fan community. She writes a lucid style. Her prose is highly readable, but also inviting us to ponder the beauty of her language in a way that never destroys the pleasure of reading these pieces. She also, and this brings me to the book she will be talking about tonight, she also has cultivated an art of moral reflection which never becomes moralizing. The introduction to These Truths is a very good example for the intellectual and effective power of Jill Lepore's writing. What we will be presented tonight is a daring synthesis of American history covering the whole ground of this nation. At first sight, one might be tempted to see one of the few female historians trying to master a genre which also in Germany is still dominated by men. The Champions League of big historical panoramas. Doorstoppers, the Fat Boys, this is a Harley-Davidson motorbike, the Moby Dicks of historical non-fiction. A genre, not surprisingly, still owned by male colleagues bathing in the public sunlight of heroic self-stylization. And it is no surprise, therefore, that in the series in which the German version of the book has appeared, Die Historische Bibliothek der Gerda Henkel Stiftung, Jill Lepore is actually the first woman to appear after, don't get this wrong, after 21 men before her. So it's about time to change things. Needless to say, Jill Lepore too has mastered a huge amount of archival material and scholarship to compose her synthesis. But in terms of composition, argument, and style, she gives us a completely different variety of the big historical book. Her prose is purged, yet supple. It easily manages to switch between places and perspectives, documents and ideas. She never just relies on the usual suspects of political history, but interweaves its entanglements with surprising changes of mood and scale, and, very importantly, of the voices of those who have too often been suppressed. These truths, as the author informs us in her introduction, was written as an old-fashioned civics book, a kind of, as the German translation puts it, Gemeinschaftskundebuch, inviting all kinds of readers to learn more about America. The many letters and commentaries Jill Lepore has received on her book confirm quite beautifully that the study does exactly what she had planned. It has inspired very young readers, immigrants striving to learn more about their new home, and also, I found that very moving, a man of more than 80 years suffering from Alzheimer's disease, who seems to have read the volume even twice, and calls the book, I quote, "my faithful and treasured companion." Before I hand over to our guest, I would like to mention two people who have contributed to this evening. And first of all, that is the German translator, Werner Roller, who produced a wonderful German version of the book. Secondly, Hanna Engelmeier, one of my colleagues at the KWI, who has alerted me to Jill Lepore's writing and managed to include Essen into the reading tour. Hanna will also talk to the author after her presentation, and I will help out with a few German translations if that is necessary. Now, I refrain from reading a couple of my favorite passages from the book, and will just finish by saying that we are all very happy to welcome Professor Lepore at this institute. You are, if I may say so, a role model of female wit and intellectuality for many of us. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Jill Lepore.
Wow, thank you so much for the introduction. That will be very difficult to live up to. I really want to now think about myself as the best of the fat boys. And I also want to thank Hanna for the invitation to come here. It's a delight to be here with you all. Thank you all for coming out this evening. So I've written a very, very long book, and yet I have just a few minutes to try to tell you about the book, and without compressing it too much. Because I wrote a long book because I thought it was necessary in a time in which I myself find myself mainly reading headlines and not much more than that, to pause and spend a long time with a single subject over, in my case, many years, but to ask readers to spend a long time with a single subject. So how I thought I would both compress this story and also not squeeze that sense of expansiveness out of it was to show you some pictures. And I want to explain what I mean about the compression. Politics operates by way of historical argument. The way politicians tell us that we should vote for them or support them is by suggesting that everything in the past leads to them and they will steer us to a future. Most historical arguments that politicians make are highly compressed historical arguments. Here's a historical argument in just 4 words. It is nevertheless a historical argument, and what can defeat these kinds of arguments are more difficult statements to make. And yet, politics operates by the battle between highly compressed historical arguments. So here's an argument from the left that is also a 4-word historical argument. In the United States, our polarized politics is a battle between these two understandings of the relationship between the past and the future. So that in 2009, after the election of Barack Obama, the protest movement that emerged to protest his election, the Tea Party movement, portrayed Obama as a betrayal of history, a betrayal of the founding of the country represented by George Washington here. In fact, a turn to communism. The Obama campaign had campaigned on behalf of the future, looking forward. That's what progressives do. They talk about progress. Progressives talk about the future and change. The Tea Party argued to stop change, to stop history was the commitment of the founding conservative movement in the United States. So we have these weird arguments that everything in the future looks this way, everything in the past tells us this, and then politics becomes a battle between these competing interpretations. At the moment, we are living in an era in American history where the battle is between people who argued for the impeachment of Barack Obama and people who are now arguing for the impeachment of Donald Trump, a kind of end of politics. I find myself, when I do a lot of work as a reporter, when I find myself reporting on these movements and going to rallies, that I've only ever found one slogan that I really agreed with. This is what I think George Washington would actually be saying. So when I set out to write this book, what I wanted to do was to ask people to set aside the four-word slogans and the understandings of history that are purely ideological, in which I use the past only to argue about how I think the future should look, but instead to go into the past and spend some time there. So how I want to try to ask us to make that journey this evening is by looking at images of the idea of the place that became the United States and that is the United States, and looking at how those images have changed over time. So all peoples represent people in the places where they live graphically. They're all kinds of two-dimensional representations of our relationship to place. This is one of the more powerful indigenous representations of the Americas, what came to be called the Americas. This is an Aztec codex, and here's a man in the center, sort of surrounded by the four points of the compass, sort of finding his way in the world, in this place. We can think about other indigenous representations of the land that Europeans would come to call America. Here, this is a cloak, a deerskin cloak that was worn by Powhatan, who was the father of Pocahontas, and it's a map of his rule. So he's the male figure is Powhatan, and then the deer and the other animal are his spiritual guides, the animals that guide him, and all the circles are the villages that pay tribute to him. So it's a conceptual map of the world. It's also a political document. It's a chronicle of his realm. It's a statement about his rule. If you look to European maps of the world, the very first European map of the world that was ever printed was actually drawn in the 7th century, but wasn't printed until 1472 after Gutenberg. And it represented the world the way medieval Christians understood the world, as being divided into three parts, a trinity. Europe, Africa, and Asia, inhabited by the descendants of the three sons of Noah, and surrounded by an ocean. It's not that Europeans thought the world physically looked like this. This is a religious map. It's a trinity. It's a divine map of the world that God has made and divided in this perfect way. When Europeans voyaged across the ocean and discovered lands unknown to them before, they pretty much called the new lands the unknown world, or the fourth part of the world. But where on a map were you going to put the fourth part of the world if you were dedicated to this vision of the world being divided into four parts? Well, the person who did that most importantly was the German map maker Martin Waldseemüller in 1507, who made this giant map of the world, this vast wall-sized map of the world, of which only one copy survives, but was immensely popular. Waldseemüller was trying to incorporate the latest discoveries of European explorers. You can see he's kind of added at the last minute the rounding of the Cape of Good Hope, because previously people didn't really know that Africa had a bottom. And he added in the cutting edge discovery of this big green blob over here to the west. And he honored on the map, up in the left, Ptolemy, the Greek mathematician, whose mathematical scheme he was using for the projection of the surface of a globe onto a flat piece of paper, and Amerigo Vespucci here on the right in the red cloak. Because Waldseemüller had read Amerigo Vespucci's Novus Mundus, The New World, which had been translated into German. And so to honor Vespucci, Waldseemüller decided to call this big green blob America. And he was the first person to do so, and that is why North America and South America are America, because of this one map and the fact that this guy had read this book in German. But this is the first representation by a European of America, but it means that Amerigo Vespucci, the Florentine, has a huge influence on how Europeans think about America. And this is a Dutch engraving from about 1600 called Vespucci Awakens a Sleeping America. And on the left, you see Amerigo Vespucci. We saw him, remember, in this map, in the red cloak at the top. Here he is, and he's holding his staff with the cross on the top and his sextant, and behind him are the boats that he has arrived in. And if you divide this image along a diagonal, everything over here is European and a celebration of European civilization, religion, the Christianity, the geographic and navigational knowledge and capacity, the technological prowess. And everything to the right represents America, the idea of America, who is allegorically represented by a naked indigenous woman. I always think of Amerigo Vespucci as the Harvey Weinstein of the age of discovery, because this, of course, this is an image of rape. This is Vespucci about to rape America. She is reclined. She's fertile. It's Europe about to seed this fertile land with the seed of Europe. But everything there's a kind of Eden-like quality, a Garden of Eden-like quality in this representation of the land and its abundance. And its technology is being celebrated here, like the canoe paddle. A canoe is an indigenous technology. But there's something else going on in this representation of America that's really powerful. If you follow the woman's hand to the plume of flame and smoke coming from the fire, you see over a spit a human leg being roasted. And that's the most important element of the argument made about America by this map, because Europeans had no legal regime available to them by which they could seize these lands. Marco Polo didn't seize China just because he went there. They had to come up with an argument. And the argument that Europeans came up with was that the native peoples were cannibals, had violated the law of nature, and therefore Vespucci could, in fact, rape this woman and take everything that is here. So it's a really important piece of the rhetoric of conquest. You can see something very different in this image of the Queen of England, Queen Elizabeth I, in 1588. This painting celebrates England's defeat of the Spanish invasion in the back, in the window. But this is at a time when England had no colonies in the Americas. But if you look at Queen Elizabeth's hand on the globe, where it's resting, the dainty little queenly hand, she's grabbing all of North America. It's this incredible, it's this very greedy hand. This is mine. This is a very weird portrait. England they have a good navy, but they don't have any colonies. I mean, it's a very weird claim. This is an image that's familiar to Americans, becomes kind of the iconography of the founding of the United States. This is a woodcut that was in Benjamin Franklin's newspaper in 1754. When the colonies, Franklin was arguing for the colonies to unite in common defense, and designed this little snake to represent the colonies. It's also a map. It's just that north is over here. So it's New England, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina. So it's a dissected snake that, join or die. I don't quite know how this snake is supposed to survive this slaughter, but you're supposed to understand this as a political cartoon. But I would argue that it's also a map, and a very particular kind of a map that was brand new, a jigsaw map. So jigsaw maps were invented by map makers to essentially reify the boundaries between nations during the period when nation states and their boundaries were just really being formed. So this is one of the very first maps that is a jigsaw map, Europe divided into its kingdoms, from 1766. And we all know these lines on the map are fictions. They're the line between France and Spain is not drawn on the land, but the Jigsaw Map actually helped Europeans and later European colonial powers teach themselves that they owned these things, that these things they had actually agreed among themselves how they would carve up, in fact, all of the Americas. So this notion that land can be carved up is a really important way of thinking about, in fact, I think what Franklin was thinking about as well. By the time of the American Revolution, America as that naked indigenous woman is a really common representation of the British colonies. Here's another image of rape, which was a common political cartoon. Here's America, the naked woman, about to be raped by a bunch of British tax collectors. This is a protest of British taxation and a call for the American Revolution, but recycling the same image of the raping of America, but just changing who the rapist is. Our Constitution, which was written in 1787, is itself a representation of the people and the place. It is a charter or a chart, like a map, that maps us to the place that we live. It was subject very early on to considerable criticism on the basis of its failure to end slavery. So here, after the American Revolution, America, that naked woman, becomes Europeanized. Here she is, reinvented as Liberty, with her Liberty cap, as an American woman who's of European descent. And this image, too, you can divide it along that diagonal. And everything on the left represents the bounty and beauty of liberty. That liberty produces the arts and sciences, supports the production and dissemination of knowledge, the wonder of the world, the beauty of literature. Classical antiquity moves forward into modernity on the shoulders of the beauty of liberty. And everything to the right is an indictment of the misery and atrocity of human slavery. And on the right, that has its allegorical figure as well. This woman right here with the kerchief is the allegorical opposite of liberty. That's the allegorical representation of slavery, an African-American woman wearing a kerchief on her head. We forget that she is an important part of the story of the picture. She's not on, there's a Statue of Liberty. You know what, that is the version of the statue. This is an early version of what becomes the Statue of Liberty. There's no statue of slavery. That figure gets erased from public memory, but was really common at the time. This is a political cartoon indicting Thomas Jefferson, who was running for re-election. Here he is as the philosophic cock. It's the name of the cartoon. Depicted with Sally Hemings, who was his wife's half-sister, also his property and the mother of 6 of his children. And she is depicted here iconographically as that icon of slavery. The woman with the kerchief would have been really recognizable at the time. The indictment of the United States for its failure to address slavery is all over the place visually. This is one of my favorite representations of it. It's a painting called it's called War News from Mexico, but what it portrays is the American Hotel. You can see at the top, the American Hotel. And on the porch of that hotel are all white men who, in 1848, anyone looking at that would say, what an incredibly diverse group of people. Because they're rich, they're poor, they're immigrant, there's like an Irishman up there, there's a German up there, they're young, they're old, they're educated, one of them can read the newspaper, not all of them look like they know how to read. But in the United States by 1848, all white men could vote. And this image is a celebration of democracy, of the extension of the right to vote to all white men, which was an incredible political revolution. And yet, the image doesn't end there, because for one thing, the porch is rotting at the top, you can sort of see. For another, if you can see to the right, leaning out of that window is a woman who would like to know what is being said on that porch. 1848 is the year women in the United States first demanded the right to vote. And then, not allowed on the porch, but quite near it, is an African-American man and a child. The child's rags indicate to us that these people are enslaved. They're not allowed on the porch, but I think really interestingly, they are the only people here who are in red, white, and blue. Like the real spirit of the United States is represented and embodied by them. not anyone else. It's actually a very subversive image. In the years before the United States fell into civil war, map makers really liked to represent the United States this way, which was to color the states that had abolished slavery, here one color, red, that includes California, and the states that had sanctioned slavery, gray, and then the states that were still up for grabs, green. This represents, these political maps of the United States look really familiar to Americans today, because this is how our presidential elections usually divide up. After Emancipation, the Emancipation Proclamation 1863, there's a whole new kind of evidence of claims about what America is. This is the abolitionist Sojourner Truth, a famous orator, former slave. You can see that she's representing herself iconographically as slavery. She's the opposite of liberty with she says the cap. But you have to pay a little bit of attention. It's hard to see. But if you can follow, it looks like she's just an old lady, grandmother knitting. But if you follow the skein, the yarn going down her lap, can anyone see what's going on? Here are the Great Lakes, and here's Maine. Go down here to Florida. Louisiana, Texas. It's very sneaky. But she's made America. It's a claim about her citizenship, but also that enslaved people built the country. It's a very powerful statement that I think we ignore at our peril. But what happens after emancipation is that the South, the Confederacy, wins the peace. By aligning itself with a new regime of racial hierarchy, the pseudoscience of what we would later call eugenics, which becomes incredibly widespread in the United States and sorts then people, let's say even the icons of liberty, into different racial classifications. So here's a eugenicist representation of liberty from 1870. In the center is the idealized European, Northern European version of liberty. And then here are all these, according to this illustration, disastrous versions of corruptions of female iconography of liberty. That European version is all over late 19th century representations, including of the conquest of the lands of the Indians of the plains. By the 1880s, an ideology of race has also led the United States for the very first time to restrict immigration, restricting the immigration of Chinese, which is depicted here in the erection of a wall on the California coast by former immigrants from other countries, including Germany and Ireland, who are taking the stones that are dismantling the Great Wall of China and using it to build a wall on the border of the United States. The 1880s, of course, though, also celebrates immigration and the Statue of Liberty, which welcomes immigrants into New York Harbor. Meanwhile, though, anti-immigration proponents in California suggested that a statue in the Pacific would look like this and would be only welcoming Chinese immigrants, and that this was considered a travesty. The ways that that figure of liberty continues well after the Civil War. We can think about all kinds of iconography in American history that is with us. Some things stay with us. The idea of building a wall somehow has recently been resurrected. The idea that populism is composed of patches putting together a hot air balloon, something I always wish would be resurrected. I think this is a brilliant political cartoon, depiction of the problems of populism in the 19th century. The iconography about monopolism that leads to, say, the board game Monopoly comes out of the same period, which is essentially a populist critique of the rich. That figure of liberty or America is used by suffragists in the 19-teens, fighting for the right to vote. But by the 19-teens, a different way of thinking about the population has emerged in ways that the United States depicts itself and understands itself. This is Henry Ford's motor plant in Michigan. And it's an image about mass production and also, therefore, of mass consumption, but it displays an extraordinary anxiety about mass society. In the early decades of the 20th century, of course, we're enormously concerned about mass society, the problem of the masses. That concern about that particular problem in the United States contributed to the restriction of immigration in 1921 and 1924, which dramatically restricted immigration from Southern Europe, not by the building of a wall, but here, as imagined, by the implementation of a funnel, where only the people from Europe that would be wanted would be allowed to come to the United States. By the time you get to the Second World War, the United States' economic power has led the country to consider itself to be a superhero. You get some sense of the place that the United States will assume after the war in the comic books from the 1940s. Captain America is introduced in 1940, Wonder Woman in 1941. These are actually recycled versions of Liberty and America, and even of Vespucci, right? Like these are very long-standing representations, and they've now become kind of pop culture comic book landscape. But we have seen America Vespucci, we've seen Captain America before, and we have seen Wonder Woman before for centuries, really. We can think, though, about the many forms of artistic expression in the 20th century that ask us to think differently about the United States. This is a part of a series of paintings, historical paintings by the African-American artist Jacob Lawrence, depicting the migration of African-Americans from the American South in the greatest migration in American history, moving to places outside of the Jim Crow South, places that did not practice the most violent forms of segregation. I think of this migration as itself looking like the continent. There's something a little bit like that Sojourner Truth play here for me, and kind of we're building the country. This is our country, the whole of the continent. There's a famous photograph of FDR assuming the power as the leader of the free world that the United States would take on after the Second World War. This is from 1942. But what I love about it is it reminds me of that Queen Elizabeth putting her hand all over the... This is FDR, like, this world, I will lead this whole world. And there's something... It's really ambitious, but it has this face-to-face something going on. This is a really powerful representation of how America had begun to understand itself by the Second World War. Basically, on the back of the military might and economic might that the United States brought to the battle with Axis powers and through the alliance. After the war, Americans began thinking about themselves, though, in a new way, not as part of a system of mass production and a mass society, but as bits of data in a newly technocratic society. Because of the machines, the general-purpose computers that were built during the Second World War, that were used after the war to count the population. For the first time in 1952, a computer was used to predict the results of an American presidential election, the very same computer that had calculated the census. And increasingly Americans, so you will say, where is America in this image? It's that printout. It's really, that's sort of who the people are at this point. We understand ourselves, even by the 1950s, as bits of data to be counted. But that sense that this technocratic society bears a kind of atlas-like weight of the world on its shoulders comes across in this image right after Sputnik, when the United States asked its scientists to defeat the USSR in this kind of race to space and race for world dominance on the back of its technocratic knowledge. By the 1960s, there's a considerable amount of disarray in the United States, a sense of growing division and resistance to conformity and to the technocracy. This is a map of the United States by the artist Jasper Johns, in which the states are all bleeding into one another, kind of melting, but also sort of bleeding. It's a very harrowing and, I think, worrying representation of the nation. The 1960s also, of course, witnesses an incredible revolution in political activism, especially from the left and especially from groups that have been left out of the economic opportunities and the political equality promised for generations, including indigenous peoples and African Americans, Chicanos. The gay and lesbian rights movement in the United States really blossoms in the 1960s with a new struggle for what the meaning of the country is, how we could even picture the country anymore. Can we all even imagine the same country. And so the very most powerful images of the nation, the flag itself, becomes a contested image. Here, in a critique of the Vietnam War, has reimagined the American flag as guns and planes. So the flag becomes part of these sort of four-word bumper sticker slogans that now are really all the political discourse in the United States. That kind of compression really accelerates after the Vietnam War. In spite of ways that people have been, at the time, are really asking Americans and everyone else around the world to think differently, to sort of forget about those jigsaw puzzle national boundaries that are all inventions and picture ourselves as living in this place, as seen from space, in the same place, in one place. The environmental movement really shakes up these claims to national identity. At the same time, though, Americans participate in what comes to be called multiculturalism. Here, at the 200th anniversary of the nation's birth, this African-American folk artist, a quilter, made this beautiful map that reimagines the diversity of Americans, reimagines the very flag as something that ordinary Americans stitch together themselves. I think it, too, is kind of a callback to Sojourner Truth. I just want to pause for a minute at this puzzling graph, and you'll say, how is that a representation of a nation? Well, I do think most of us carry around in our heads understandings of our nations and other nations that actually look like this, that are the product of social science research, because we do actually sort ourselves into these understandings of change over time. This is a chart that plots from the end of the Second World War to the recent present income inequality in blue. So when the blue line is low, the gap between the rich and the poor is low, and as that rises, the gap between the rich and the poor gets wider. And on red is plotted political polarization. And I can explain later how this is measured, but when political polarization is low, the distance between our two political parties, the Republican and Democratic Party, is narrow, and when it's high, it's wider. Now, if you were to chart that all the way to 2019, we'd be well into the dropped ceiling. These trends have significantly worsened. But the question that I put this slide up in front of my students all the time to ask is, what's the relationship between the red curve and the blue curve? Is there some other thing we'd want to plot here that would explain both of them? Why do they track each other so closely? The internet was promoted by people who suggested that wiring us all to one another would solve both of these problems, both in the United States and around the world. That to be wired would be to come to an end of the problems of economic inequality and of political polarization, and indeed of national division, like we would all live in harmony after being all wired. That was the vision of Wired magazine. That had its very early critics. This is a really powerful work of art at the Smithsonian Museum of American Art by the Korean-American artist Nam June-paik. It's bigger than this room. Each state has multiple displays, video displays, whose audio is at top volume, and they're broadcasting something about each of their part of the country. And no matter how close you walk to the wall or how far, you can never understand a single word that's being said, because it's an allegory about the internet. Everyone is broadcasting, but no one is listening. So this is before social media, to remind you that there was a lot of concern about the internet as a form of communication and as instituting new kind of loss of community, even before social media. I just want to think about the ways in which, to suggest to you, Americans have a complicated relationship with their past that for a large part of the population involves veneration, reenactment, and play. The Tea Party movement was a political movement, but it was also a sort of festival of costume. And that our traditions of political protest have very long histories. The using a wall to protest an immigration policy has itself a very long history. We have with us still many of the graphic representations, the political maps of the United States that look certain ways, in which we're asked to always think about ourselves as divided by the way our state votes in our electoral college. But I think of all the images of the United States recently that I have found most powerful. None is more powerful than this by the African-American artist Glenn Ligon, one of a series called Double America, in which Ligon was attempting to represent that half of the country sees things one way while the other half sees everything exactly the opposite way. And yet we are all hitched to one another for the time being. Ligon always said that one of his inspirations was Charles Dickens's Tale of Two Cities. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. And I think to my fellow Americans, indeed, it is both of those things. Thank you.
This was quite a wild ride, if I might say, through the American history. Actually, I prepared a bunch of questions that I'm intending not all to ask, but while seeing your presentation, I was thinking about the notion. I was thinking about the relation between representation and figuration, because your book that we all can see here is more of panorama of American history, and what we've seen in your talk were mostly figurations, representations of nations. And I was wondering if you could talk about this a little more, maybe, about the difference between panorama and very distinct figures that we met.
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting question. I struggled with what would be a kind of shorthand way to depict change over time in a brief talk. The panorama that the book, as you generously describe it, attempts to offer is a slow-moving one. You know, we do move almost sort of year by year. We hopefully don't pause. There has to be a lot of, in the storytelling in the book, to get someone to read a long book, there has to be quite a bit of momentum. You have to kind of be curious to see what's going to happen next, and you want to keep gazing across. And in such a device, I am in control of everything that you see and what you get to look at. And that's the excitement of doing that kind of work. In this sort of slideshow version of that here, we're looking at representations that other people have offered up, and then I have to do the work of interpretation. And it has a kind of staccato quality. So it's more like, you're too young for this, but a film strip, like a very fast film strip where you just go, and you could do that if you were. It would be very cool to do an animated version of this talk, starting with the figure of America as a name on a map and moving all the way to this, and almost kind of watching the representations, the figures be transformed one into the other. But I don't have the capacity to do that. But that would be something that would be slightly closer, I think, almost to the panorama.
And even though you present this much and touch upon so various issues, your focus is like the political history of the United States. And why do you privilege that over like everyday history or social history? And why do you think that the momentum now is very good for bringing this to a German readership? What makes your book interesting for us?
So when I trained as a historian, most of us were training as social and cultural historians. We studied the experience, very much influenced by the French Annales School. We studied the experiences of ordinary people and ordinary places. And I would say my greatest intellectual influence as a young scholar was Natalie Zeman Davis, the French historian. If anyone's read or seen The Return of Martin Guerre, that's sort of how you understand and make sense and order of an entire world by looking really closely at an ordinary person's life and what that explodes for you about how people make meaning and how they live their lives. And I, in particular, wanted to do women's history when I went to graduate school. But I didn't end up doing women's history, actually, because increasingly I saw that for all the rich work within universities on social history and cultural history, the books in the bookstore that people were reading in the United States were these big fat boy books that were histories of, Sherman's march during the Civil War, the Great Brigade, the D-Day invasion, the excellence of Dwight Eisenhower, a new biography of Abraham Lincoln. And not that those aren't compelling, important stories, but that's all that the public understood to be history. And everything that was being done in the academy, honestly, at a time when the faculty was much more likely to be women and people of color, was considered irrelevant to anything that the public could ever be interested in. And that seemed to me a very volatile situation. If historical knowledge is demeaned because women and people of color are writing it, and because they're writing about women and people of color, then can the public know what the university has to teach? So I, in my own teaching and in my own writing, got really worried about that problem. And one of the things I really like about writing for The New Yorker is it's an opportunity to, help bring some of the really exciting work that actually comes from social historians and cultural historians into a larger public conversation. But it's also the case that the dedication of the generation that I'm from, of scholars who want to study social history and cultural history to those questions, which were really urgent, meant that people didn't study political history, legal history, constitutional history. And by now, in schools, that's not actually taught very much anymore. So American school children don't really know very much about the Constitution. So when I would find when I wrote for The New Yorker, I wrote an essay once about the why we have nominating conventions for our presidents, why the parties get together and have a big party and decide who's going to be the candidate. And all the email I always got was from young people saying, "Oh my God, I didn't know parties were in the Constitution. I didn't know conventions weren't, they didn't start until 1830. It's just not taught." And we are living in a time where we are so precarious, our system of government and the rule of law is so precarious that it seemed to me really the right thing to do in writing a new account of the United States, to incorporate the social and cultural history into the people whose stories I'm able to tell. I wouldn't be able to tell the stories of so many different sorts of people and offer different kinds of voices if all that research hadn't been done, but to present them all as political actors, to give them the dignity of being not just subjects of curiosity for people looking to redeem people from obscurity, but people who actually change the world.
Sollen wir zwischendurch kurz zusammenfassend übersetzen oder ist das für Sie nicht nötig? Gut, dann mache ich das aber nur ganz kurz. Jill Lepore hat zunächst auf die Frage, wie verhalten sich denn diese Aspekte von Repräsentation und Figuration in ihrer Darstellung zueinander? Also sie hat uns ja jetzt nicht die Geschichte nochmal erzählt, die sie in ihrem Buch erzählt, sondern sie hat eine Dia-Show geliefert, die mit einer ganz anderen Form von visueller Repräsentation arbeitet. Und das Wichtigste, was sie hierzu gesagt hat, ist eigentlich, dass es sowohl für das Buch als auch für den Vortrag eine Frage des Timings ist, um zu entscheiden, wie man diesen riesigen Wust an Material, den sie verarbeitet hat, ein sehr langer Zeitraum, eine große Dichte an Fakten und Details so komponiert, dass auch etwas entsteht, was vergnüglich ist, was einen gewissen Spannungseffekt erzeugt. Und damit arbeitet sie auf ganz unterschiedliche Weise. Also es geht um das, was sie Momentum nennt. Es geht auch um unser Vergnügen an einem bestimmten Erzähltempo und an der Gestaltung dieses Materials. Sie hat auch gesagt, sie würde gern eigentlich aus diesen stillen Bildern, die sie aneinandergereiht hat, noch so etwas wie einen Animated Film, also einen bewegten Film machen. Und sie hat auch das, was sie gemacht hat, als eine Art von beschleunigtem Filmskript beschrieben. Also es sind alles insgesamt ziemlich ungewöhnliche Formen. Sie haben sicher auch in Ihrem Vortrag gemerkt, dass sie mit bestimmten akademischen Routinen auf erfreulich respektlose Weise bricht. Und dadurch wird die Sache natürlich wesentlich unterhaltsamer, ohne dass sie dadurch weniger tief und informativ wird. Die zweite Frage bezog sich auf die Genres der Geschichtsschreibung, die Hanna Engelmeier angesprochen hat. Also das ist eine politische Geschichte. Und das ist jetzt nicht unbedingt das, was als besonders fortschrittlich gilt. Die Frage war auch, warum jetzt eine politische Geschichte Amerikas für ein deutsches Publikum? Und Jill Lepore hat etwas auch über ihre eigene Ausbildung jetzt gesagt. Sie hat sich vor allem als junge Historikerin für Sozial- und Kulturgeschichte interessiert, und zwar in der französischen Tradition der Annales-Schule. Eine ihrer wichtigen Lehrerinnen und Vorbilder war Natalie Zemon Davis, die besonders berühmt geworden ist für eine Form der Geschichtsschreibung, die sich eben gerade nicht an den großen Männern und ihren großen Ideen orientiert, sondern am Alltag ganz normaler Menschen. Und auf diese Weise kann man besonders gut Mikrogeschichte schreiben, das wäre der Technical Term dafür, wenn man sich nicht nur die großen Führer und die großen Helden anschaut, dann sieht man, wenn man es so gut macht, wie sie es auch macht, dass selbst ein winziger Ausschnitt aus einem scheinbar ganz unspektakulären Leben sehr, sehr viel Interessantes und Überraschendes zu bieten vermag. Sie hat dann nicht den Weg gewählt, zum Beispiel in die feministische Geschichte, in die Geschlechtergeschichte zu gehen, was ein Weg gewesen wäre aus dieser sozial- und kulturhistorischen Schulung, sondern sie hat im Grunde einen ganz anderen interessanten Weg eingeschlagen, nämlich all das, was sie dort gelernt hat, zum Beispiel auch über die unterdrückten Stimmen und Dokumente der Geschichte, über das Leben all derer, das immer als zu unspektakulär galt, um es historisch zu erzählen. Sie hat das aufgenommen, das aufgesogen, das eingesammelt und ist aber zurückgekehrt in die scheinbar traditionellen Königsdisziplinen wie politische Geschichte, Rechtsgeschichte, Verfassungsgeschichte, weil ihr Eindruck auch ist, gerade in der momentanen politischen Situation, dass insbesondere junge Leute an diesen Punkten auch einen gewissen Informationsbedarf haben. Sie füttert also sozusagen all das, was sie in der Sozial- und Kulturgeschichte gelernt hat, zurück in diese andere Form einer scheinbar konventionelleren Geschichtsschreibung und erfindet die damit auch um.
Okay, thank you. I have two more questions before we open up for the broader public. I found it very convincing what you said about the combination of more broad and social and micro history, and also for those of you who have read your previous work, you will all encounter like protagonists of earlier books again in your history of the United States, for example, Jane Franklin. You mentioned your essays that were also my first meeting with your text in the New Yorker, and I was curious to talk to you a little more about your style as a writer and how your book is written. And I stumbled upon one sentence in the introduction that I really loved. I liked it very much. You talk about the footnotes you included in your book, and you said you write some very important events haven't made it into the footnotes, which I've clipped and short like a baby's fingernails. And I really like this image of a baby's fingernails and this far as I'm informed, with the very little ones, with the infants, you don't cut them with scissors, but you have to chew them because they're so soft. And I found it a very very moving image. And when I read this sentence, I was wondering if a man would have written that sentence to describe his method of referencing sources, which is really what you do in the footnotes. And I would love to know, is there a certain style of writing that you might describe as female to what you do?
Well, I'm glad that captured your notice. That is what you do with a baby's fingernails. It's a deliberate choice, especially there early in the book. And I do that occasionally in essays. And I think of it as a kind of outing, like outing myself both as a woman and as a mother. Not because I write from a position in that sense, but because I'm trying to disrupt the convention that we all write from the position of being a man. Mm-hmm. And so I remember an early time that I did that, when a very early essay I wrote for The New Yorker was about Benjamin Franklin. And I was explaining how he could make a very, very strong argument very gracefully, mm-hmm. and almost sort of sneak it in. And I said he swaddled his arguments like infants, mm-hmm. Which, when you have a baby and you wrap it up and it quiets down and it's calm, but it's still a crazy baby. And I got a lot of mail about it. Mm-hmm. Actually, I found that was, and a lot of it was from female readers who said, I looked at your essay and it was about Benjamin Franklin, and geez, who cares? But then I started reading, and I love that thing about that's exactly what it is to deliver an effective argument. It's just like swaddling a baby. And it actually seemed to me that it allowed certain kinds of essays to reach new readers. Mm-hmm. And because I had found that when I wrote about politics, I don't like Google myself, or I have no social media, so I don't know people's reactions except for how they email me. And I found that when I wrote about politics, I get a lot of mail from men, but never any mail from women. But if I wrote about something non-political, especially something more conventionally like Ladies' Page, I got only mail from women. Mm-hmm. So I was trying to mess that up a little bit, and it weirdly works. Like it does snag a reader who wants to say, I don't care about this. This is the same old crap. And it's sort of like, oh, my imagination matters. Like I think it says to a female reader, the ways that I think about the world that might be a little bit different, that I have been told are not knowledge. Mm-hmm. That it's not actually knowledge to know how to swaddle a baby or clip a baby's fingernails. That's just some like mammalian instinct or something. That's animal. Mm-hmm. But that actually is cerebral, and it's beautiful and it's powerful and it's got a force. So it's a long answer, but it's purposeful.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's very convincing to me, at least. You also have written about the responses you've got on your book from male readers too. So this relates to what you've just said, because you write that, I'm quoting you, I've been scolded almost exclusively by historians who are men for not including more on 1,000 incidents of scant significance. As a matter of sexual politics, I find this sort of condescension, man-descension, fascinating, as intellectual exchange is unedifying. And you also write about like the great works of your foreigners you have read, who mostly were also men, and like the history of the political histories of America. And I was wondering what qualities of your foreigners did you find useful then? What was helpful for you in writing this massive history?
So I should say, I don't mean to like. There was a real pattern to the men who wrote to me. Mm-hmm. That is a kind of continuation of the essay thing. Like when I get a lot of corrections from men. Men really like to correct women. Mm-hmm. And not all men. Men are wonderful. Like, that is not a, but there's a certain, just, I must tell you, you do not belong writing about this stuff, because I am not a Harvard professor, but I obviously know more than you. That, I get that all the time. Mm-hmm. And it, sometimes they're right. Like, sometimes I made an error and I said, well, thanks so much. I really appreciate it. Like, but usually almost always they're wrong. And the thing with this big book, you know, when you write a long book, I left a lot out. I had to leave a lot out. And it's not the last work of American history. You're welcome to write your own version and include what you want to include. But a lot of it is, I still am surprised by it. I was at a panel like this, and a man got up and said very fiercely that he put down the book and never read the rest of it when he got to the point where he discovered that I had not mentioned Leisler's Rebellion. And everyone in the room kind of looked around at each other like, should we know what Leisler's Rebellion is? And I said, I know that your career has been a study of Leisler's Rebellion, but it turns out the average person interested in American history does not urgently need to know about Leisler's Rebellion. And the fact that you can't see that is your problem, not mine. You know, like, it was a weird, that's what I mean with the sort of unedifying exchange. It's not the case that a woman couldn't have made that same claim, but my experience of it is almost always a kind of, you've tread too far into my territory.
Maybe this is a good point to engage, especially the male audience tonight, to ask your questions, because I have touched upon various issues, but there is obviously way more to discuss when, like, pondering the situation of America in the world now and how it relates to its vast history. So I would invite you to ask Professor Lepore your questions. Bitte.
Das Mikro kommt.
I have a question about your book, which I only partially could read. Sorry for this. But what interests me a lot was that you write about the machine state. You write about the people, you write about the nation state, you write about the machine. And from Second World War on, it's the age of the machine. You had a picture here about the data citizen, about the ENIAC computer, and you said the citizen is transformed to a data bit. We have a data state. So what do you mean by that? Does it mean we have influence by electronic modes of communication, as we can see in the political calculations of polls, of votes, or as we could see with Cambridge Analytica in the last presidential election? Or do you say we have a deep transformation of the character of the state itself, not only by the influence who is putting pressure on the institutions? And there was a time, I think it was in the 50s, 60s, Cold War times, when there was the cybernetic vision of the state, trying to transform the state via technocracy into a peace project. But it was from a central perspective. Mm-hmm. I think this did not have really success. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Now we have another mode, another form in which electronic media influence the governance modes and the political scene. So would you really say it is a data state, or is a data-driven citizen or user that is, in effect, the opposite side of the state?
Mm-hmm. So the opposite side is what I mean, but I also just pause a minute for people who haven't read the book, but also to think about that as the latest version of a transformation in what a citizen is, as opposed to there once were citizens and this was perfect and now people have been reduced to data. In the larger sweep of American history, what citizenship means in our system of government is consenting to be governed by representatives, by elected representatives, to whom you do not delegate your interests, but who you elect to represent your interests, right? So it's a kind of submersion of self in the interests of a larger body. That, American historians would say, was deeply challenged by the rise of mass consumption, in which the citizen, the voter, kind of was reimagined as a customer. And so we have what American historians would call consumer politics, where in fact, it's not that the citizen elects representatives, it's that politicians buy voters. They sell themselves to voters, and then they also buy voters. It's almost a kind of monetary exchange because of the system of mass advertising, right? So you have to have that intermediate step in which the citizen is sort of replaced with the consumer, I think, if you were to buy this argument. And when we think of that kind of post-World War II era, the consumer politics really dates to the 1920s and the rise of mass advertising. And is associated with all kinds of problems of propaganda, right? Because instruments of mass communication are used, obviously, as we know here and in the United States, principally the radio, to send messages, sell messages to customers who are citizenry. The turn to understanding a citizen as a unit of data, I think, moves from the user, which is a kind of 70s idea, 70s and 80s idea, of people who use computers as users of computers, to the reality in which computers are using us, like we are the used, not the users, right? In which our data is extracted and used by politicians to send us targeted messages. That's the system that I was attempting to sort of see as the latest manifestation of a change. Because what's difficult in a world in which let's say I did understand myself as essentially a piece of data to be kind of bought and sold, understood in order to target political messages or manipulate me in some way, is that I understand myself as expressing myself as an atomized individual, which is not the same as consenting to a representative form of government. That's why everything feels like a referendum. Why everything is a plebiscite. I don't know if that word translates at all well. Where it's not as though even our impeachment proceedings didn't proceed until the Democrats decided that polls supported impeachment, when in fact impeachment is not put to the people in a referendum for a reason, because we have a representative government which is supposed to exert its leadership and decide whether or not to, begin an impeachment inquiry. But because of our social media landscape and because of data mining, it's possible to know at any minute what so many people think, that everything is a referendum and nothing is an actual vote. And I think that seizes up politics all over the world right now. I think representation is a beautiful idea, but it does require a suppression of your individual interest-driven exertion.
Thank you so much for this talk today, and also for the book, which I'm in the process of reading. So I was intrigued by the title, and I think it's a great, interesting choice to talk about truths. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about what informed your choice of this title, if that was. If it was even your choice, or if it was something.
Yeah, no, thank you. It's a great question. So I originally wanted to call the book, what the title of this presentation is, American History from Beginning to End, because it's a story, and it has a sort of storybook quality to it. There's a kind of archaic prose, and I just thought that was a fun title. But that was when the book was originally going to end with Barack Obama's inauguration in 2009. And then it sort of seemed like it would be beginning, middle, end, like, ta-da, the end. And then when Donald Trump was elected and I had to end the book with Trump's election, then suddenly calling the book American History from beginning to end seemed like a highly polarizing, partisan statement. And I knew it would be read that way, even though it had nothing to do with that. I just meant chronologically, like, it's a big book, prepare yourself. So I had to obviously throw away that title. And I like these truths, and I'm happy with the title, because the book asks readers to understand that living in any form of democracy, any representative government, is a burden, because it requires you to try to ascertain the truth of the matter, that the United States system of government, the world's first modern democracy, is a child of the Enlightenment and its empiricism. And it requires inquiry. Like, we think about our dedication to equality, but that is founded on inquiry. And so it's a bit of the book's kind of challenge to the reader to say, the book sort of says, this is a long, hard book. Take your time, but also take it seriously, because it's hard to live in a democracy. It should be hard. And if it's as easy as tweeting, I frickin' hate you, then that is not enough. That's not enough. So it's meant to be demanding that way. That truth is, it's hard to figure out what's true, but it's your obligation.
I found your title especially welcomed, because I have lived in America, and it's a long time ago, but I found that people have a tendency, especially in the US, we do too, but to believe their myth, their stories, their legends. And everyone has a different legend, has a different myth, and they fight for that is the truth. Nothing that you can tell from your perspective will change their minds. And it's so difficult to even get them to inquire, to find out if what they have been taught in school or by their peers or by their parents is really what has happened for the general population, or if it's just their, as they now say, tribe. At that time we didn't use that word, but for their circle.
Yeah.
And if you don't travel in those circles, you just don't belong there, and your story is a different one. So to talk about different truth, I mean, it's especially now you can see where that leads to when you have believe your own stories, your own legends.
Right, right. We have an expression that's very popular in the United States where people will urge each other to speak their truth. They'll say, speak your truth, speak your truth. And then it's only your truth. It's very disquieting.
So maybe I just go again. I was wondering if the underlying argument of your book is somewhat that in the current turmoil that you touched upon briefly, it is important for America to get a new understanding of what it is as a nation and what it relies on in relation to its truth that you already mentioned in the title. And I was wondering if it's not maybe a little provocative to say, well, think about about our nation and not think about the nations we're in very close contact with. So this is again referring to the relation of the global and the regional, so to say. So how do these two relate in a history of America that is very much focused on what is happening on the inside?
Yeah. Well, Americans, like much of the world, really abandoned the writing of national history after the Second World War because of the terrible horrors committed in the name of nationalism, in the name of national myths, in the name of the greatness of the German nation, the greatness of the Japanese Empire, the greatness of Mussolini's Italy, like the nationalist claims led to incredible violence and aggression and genocide. And so many historians simply disavowed writing about the nation. By the time you get to the 1980s, they really aren't in the United States. They're just, no one has written national history for decades. And instead, they're dreaming the dream of globalism. They're dreaming the dream by the 1980s that the nation state is dying out, is essentially obsolete. We're in the era of the European Union. It's the Cold War is coming to an end. Communism is, the nationalism is on the wane. That the future will be a future of global ties. We have accelerated forms of transportation and communication and global markets, and people who are globalists are flying all over the world to international meetings, and the future is all global. And so when I was even in graduate school, people were writing global history. The whole new thing. No one should write a national history. That is the way. What are you, living in the 1930s? Global history is everything that we should be studying. Either we study microhistory and the tiny things and obscure people, or we study the whole world. And no one was studying the nation state as a unit with a history. And I think that contributed to the rise to power of nationalists, because people living in nation states in Europe, in the United States, all over the world, need stories about their people that make sense, that are sweeping accounts of who a people are as a nation, and what happens when people change but still live in a nation. And without those stories, people kind of flail around wondering, what is Britain now? What is Germany now? What is France now? What is the United States now? Who are we? And nationalists come in and say, I'll tell you who we are. I will tell you in 4 words. And that's it. and that space is opened up by historians and political scientists, and for good reason, imagining that we were about to enter a global era, wired and international and interneted, and that turned out to be wrong. So in the United States in particular, we don't have a tradition of reckoning with the past as atrocity. The atrocity of slavery, of genocide, of indigenous peoples, the disenfranchisement of women. We don't have any, especially slavery and segregation, we just don't have we've never had a reckoning with it. And that's another reason people failed to write those histories, because they thought, well, how do you even do that? While maybe also celebrating all the things that are great about American history and about American foreign policy and its history, and American idealism. So that's why I wrote the book, because I am so worried about the turmoil, and I was so worried about it when I wrote the book. It's sort of, and that in terms of like, why should people outside of the United States read that? It's like, well, what would it look like to think about the nation state as the invention of modernity that guarantees rights to people? There isn't some other invention. There's no other thing we invented that guarantees rights to people. And it's not very successful all the time. It's not always successful. It's not uniformly successful. But it's worth really studying it.
Ja. Soll ich Ihnen noch kurz ein paar Ideen? Herr Grünzweig, noch ein.
Yeah, just reaction to that. Do you think this question of who are we, what's a nation, so on, is sort of an anthropological necessity? Because after all, the notion of the nation was only invented about 200 years ago, and we might well have figured that maybe by the 1950s or 1960s it was just out. And now are you saying, no, this is something that will be sort of a permanent requirement? Obviously, you're doing a different thing, writing your story of the nation, but still, I mean, so you think this is sort of a permanent necessity that people sort of reassure?
So no, I don't think it's permanent. I just wrote a short book called The Case for the Nation that's sort of a history of nationalism. And what I say there is, look, maybe we won't always have nation states, but while we do, it's no use pretending that we don't have them and not explaining what they are and maybe defending the idea of them. Because if liberals who believe in a liberal nation state don't do that intellectual work as public work, then the only people who are talking about the nation are illiberal, race-based nationalists. So I don't know about you, but I don't feel like liberals can afford to not talk about what a nation is. But no, that's not permanent. This is where we are. It's like live in the world that we live in seems an important commitment.
Eine letzte Frage hier vorne noch.
Yeah, I'm wondering what the impact of economic history in your presentation was or should be. You talked a lot about cultural history, you talked about social history, but you also had this slide on the car factory in the 1910s, and the argument was that mass production leads to a mass society. So one could argue that, let's say, social history is always closely connected with economic history. So what's the impact or influence of economic history in your, let's say, reconstruction of the history of the United States?
Yeah, thanks for that.
And the other question is, put yourself in a position, let's say, in 2029, and you had to present a lecture on most recent history, let's say on the period since the first election of Obama. So what would it look like?
Yeah, that's another question.
Yeah.
Let me just say, although not in my presentation, there's a lot of economic history in the book. There's a whole history of capitalism. There's an explanation of the relationship between capitalism and the Atlantic slave trade. We follow the story of industrialization. We follow the story of mass production and mass consumption. We look at the prosperity after the war and the age of abundance. There's hundreds of pages of economic history in the book that I couldn't also present in this talk. And it's not something I can really summarize here.
I mean, the systematic impact.
Yeah, systematically, I'm a political historian. I believe that change is caused by political change. I'm not an economic determinist. I'm not an economic historian in the sense that my primary commitment is not to an economic explanation of change over time. I think economic change over time is largely a function of politics rather than the reverse. So that is how the argument of the book works, but that's not to say that there's not a lot of history of economics in the book. With regard to what the world will look like or what in 2029, when you get a PhD in history, you have to slice open your hand and take a quill of blood and sign that you will never make such a prediction. Just it's a requirement. Not allowed.
Okay, so we're glad that you don't cross this boundary today. Will you do or try?
I will just give a very, very brief summary of some of the things you said. Im Grunde geht es den ganzen Abend schon um die Idee der Repräsentation als dem wesentlichen Leitmotiv der amerikanischen Demokratie. Man könnte auch sagen, dem Verhältnis zwischen den Einzelnen und dem Ganzen oder den Teilen und dem Ganzen. Und Repräsentation heißt, ich lasse mich vertreten in der Regierung. Ich bestimme nicht direkt immer mit, sondern es gibt andere, die für mich abstimmen. Und diese Repräsentation, sagt Jill Lepore, ist im Moment in einer sehr schwierigen Situation und sie erzeugt eine Reihe von Problemen, die auch angesprochen wurden von dieser Frage, ist der Staat jetzt selbst die Maschine oder geht es hier in diesem Buch eher um die Einzelnen, die noch Maschinen nutzen? Und hier hat sie skizziert, dass es sich eher aus einer utopischen in eine dystopische Richtung bewegt. In den 60er Jahren haben wir noch über einzelne Maschinennutzer gesprochen und mittlerweile haben wir es eher mit einem Staat zu tun, der sich als Maschine geriert, die uns regiert. Sie riskiert eine Reihe von interessanten Provokationen, die auch, würde ich sagen, für progressive Akademiker relativ überraschend und ungewöhnlich sind. In diesem Zusammenhang hat Hanna Engelmeier nach der Rolle der Nation gefragt. Also für klassische linksliberale Historikerinnen und Historiker ist die Nation eine Igitt-Kategorie. Das macht man nicht mehr. Man schreibt keine Nationalgeschichte. Man schreibt Weltgeschichte, Globalgeschichte, Mikrogeschichte, Kulturgeschichte. Aber man versucht, diese Kategorie der Nationen zu durchkreuzen, zu dekonstruieren. Und sie hat gerade in der momentanen Situation die interessante Position, es bringt uns überhaupt nichts politisch, wenn wir die Kategorie der Nation sozusagen exorzistisch austreiben, weil wir uns in einer Lage befinden, in der wir uns es nicht leisten können, es den Nationalisten zu überlassen, zu bestimmen, wer wir sind, was die Nation leisten kann und nicht leisten kann. Wir haben es nun immerhin noch immer mit Nationalstaaten zu tun und deswegen ist es für Sie auch Aufgabe progressiver Historikerinnen und Historiker, positiv diese Frage zu beantworten, wer sind wir denn? Ja, das muss nicht anthropologisch basiert werden. Das ist für Sie keine anthropologische Kategorie, sondern eine historische und politische Kategorie, mit der wir uns im Moment befassen müssen, um es nicht denjenigen zu überlassen, die sehr Ungutes damit anfangen. Auch der Titel dieses Werkes ist eine Provokation. Sie wollte es am Anfang nennen, amerikanische Geschichte vom Anfang bis zum Ende. Das hätte politische Resonanzen erzeugen können, die auch nicht ganz glücklich gewesen wären. Aber auch dieser Titel ist provokant, weil die Wahrheiten ja versprechen könnten, dass hier einfache Wahrheiten bestätigt werden. Sie meint aber diesen Titel eher als Aufgabe, als Auftrag, als Herausforderung nachzudenken, ob denn diese 3 großen Wahrheiten der amerikanischen Verfassung noch taugen, danach zu fragen, was sie für uns tun und an jeden Leser, und sie schreibt ganz bewusst für ein sehr großes Publikum, geht der Auftrag, beim Lesen aktiv darüber nachzudenken. Der letzte Punkt vielleicht noch zu all dem, was sie über ihre Rolle als Frau in diesem Feld gesagt hat. Das finde ich natürlich ziemlich großartig. Man könnte auf die Idee kommen, dass ihr Stil ein weiblicher Stil ist, weil sie zum Beispiel, wie wir an diesem wunderschönen Bild der Fußnoten, die so kurz geschnitten sind wie die Fingernägel eines Säuglings, sagen könnten, naja, das schreibt halt nur eine Frau. Auf diese Idee kommt nur eine Frau. Diese Köder legt sie aus. Auf der einen Seite sagt sie, ich möchte zeigen, dass ich als Frau, als Mutter schreibe. Und das seht ihr vielleicht auch in meinen Metaphern. Auf der anderen Seite durchkreuzt sie ganz geschickt solche Geschlechterstereotypen, Zuschreibungen. Und was sie eigentlich interessiert, ist eher eine, ich würde jetzt mal sagen, Kombination aus Stärke und Zartheit. Und das ist etwas, was man gar nicht mehr als typisch männlich oder weiblich beschreiben kann, sondern einfach als, ich würde sagen, einen großartigen Stil, der wirkungsvoll ist, ohne dass er Konventionen aufruft, die wir jetzt als männlich oder weiblich ablegen können. I wanted to end on a note of delighted surprise, Jill, because we are going to start a series of lectures which is called in German Das große Ganze, the big whole, W-H-O-L-E. And without having talked about your talk before, you presented a lot of material, for instance, on globes, on maps, on men standing next to globes, putting their fingers on the planet and so forth, which surprisingly will reappear in the lectures to come. Because we are, in this semester, interested in the manifold relations between the parts and the whole, the individuals and the nations or the society. So this was, without having prepared that, the most beautiful introduction you could also give to that little series of lectures, to which everybody in the room is, of course, invited. Do join us for the next lectures for the große Ganze. And it just remains to be said that this was incredibly informative, splendid, and also very funny. And we thank you for visiting the Institute. Thanks for being here.
Thanks so much.